Good evening. Thank you for joining me tonight, and thank you at home as well. Tonight we have a very interesting discussion because tonight we're going to be talking about you, me, and the trees outside in the field. And those trees are going to teach us a very powerful message. The message that we do make a difference. One of the obstacles that we all face in life on a regular basis is the fact that we are one limited, minute individual. We look out at the world around us, especially as we grow older, and we understand that it is a big world that's out there, and that we are one human being amongst billions of people and creatures and animals and objects and all of these vast workings of society in the universe that God created. And the result is that we start to feel marginalized. We start to think, how can we truly have an impact on the world around us? And the subject line from that is that we no longer feel motivated and inspired to truly go out and do our best work. And many of us live our life in what you might call status quo. Status quo meaning that we go out, we work, we raise a family, maybe we do a little study, a little personal exploration, but in the back of our heads we feel that true change, true difference to the world is kind of beyond us. It's beyond us. We're simply one small blip on the radar. And with a world as huge and dynamic as it is, how can I truly impact and make a difference? And therefore, why try? Let me just mind my business, conduct my affairs, keep my nose clean, and I will have lived an okay life. And we all know that mediocre is not an aspiration. It's not an aspiration. Shooting for the stars means to shoot for excellence. That's what our parents teach us. That's what our teachers tell us. That we have to shoot for the stars. We have to try to be as great as possible and excel in whatever way we can. And yet we realize as we get older and older, reality sets in. And we understand that we have limitations and there's so much that we can do, and therefore our perspective changes. And it takes away our ability to dream, our ability to create. And those are terrible talents to waste. How do you understand the difference that you can make in this world? How do you maintain that dream, that reality that you can bring about? Even when you see it's a huge dynamic world, even when you see events that are transpiring that seem to be beyond your control, how do you still maintain that belief in your true potential? So tonight we're going to take an example from a plain old tree. A tree. We all have trees. Sometimes they may be oak trees. Here in South Tampa, we're very proud of our oak trees, which take hundreds of years to grow and reflect the character of God's creation. And we also have beautiful palm trees, which sway in the breeze and kind of reflect the beauty of our surroundings. And we love our weather. So for those of you that were following Groundhog's Day last week and heard the terrible news that there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter, down here that was celebrated. But trees are truly very, very telling creations. And this week, in fact, is the New Year for trees. The 15th day of the Hebrew month of Shevat is the New Year for trees, known as the Rosh Hashanah for trees. So the obvious question is, why do we celebrate a New Year for trees? There are many creations in the world, many different creatures, different vegetation, different animals, different inanimate objects. Why specifically do we take trees, raise them to this amazing status, and say, you're going to get one day a year where we celebrate your creation? It's the New Year just for trees. Now, we talked only a couple of weeks ago about a New Year being a time for reflection and introspection, and why we have it set up on the calendar, because it has such amazing power to help guide the rest of our year, just like a head does. And that's what we call it Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, because it helps guide the rest of the year. Well, here's the head of the year for trees. So how are trees going to help us guide ourselves through life? So the first thing to understand is that physically, trees do play a very, very important role in our lives. We don't always realize that, but trees do. They emit oxygen. They also decrease the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which are two processes that we couldn't live without. If there wouldn't be enough oxygen, or if there would be too much carbon dioxide, human life would be impossible. So, on a basic level, we need to have trees. They provide foliage to cover over the earth and allow us some shade and respite from the sun. They prevent erosion, which is something that would have taken place should the lack of vegetation constantly be spurred. They allow full ecosystems to develop underneath their protection. So trees truly play a very important part with their wood, their bark, their fruits, things that we eat, things that we use. The textbook we're using tonight would not be possible without a tree. So they are very much an integral part of our lives today. But that being said, that's all about our physical life. And a Rosh Hashanah, a new year, is more of a spiritual day. As we know, Rosh Hashanah for us is a spiritual day. It's a day when we reflect on who we are and what we're going to be doing over the coming year. So Rosh Hashanah for trees also should have some spiritual significance. Not just the fact that we like having trees because they give us something to climb, which was my first interaction with trees. In fact, I broke my arm when I was 9 years old falling off of a tree. So we've been intimately connected, trees and myself, for many, many years. So what spiritual lesson does the tree teach us that we set aside this special day? In the 5th book of the 5 books of Moses, the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, Torah says, Ki ha'adam eitz hasada, man is like a tree in the field. Chapter 20, verse 19, it's set forth very clearly that human beings are compared to trees in the field. Why specifically? The prophet Isaiah says that as the days of a tree shall be the days of my people. So again, it's not just a fluke. Isaiah also reiterates what's written by Moses in the 5 books of Moses, that human beings are compared to trees. Their days, their style, humans and trees are very similar. Okay, so if humans and trees are very similar, hopefully we can learn something from them. Do you want us to throw something out, David? A comparison between a tree and a human being. Anything. Any comparison between a tree and a human being.
Roots.
Roots. Very good. So, trees and human beings have multiple components that are very similar. Let's start with the tree. What are the 3 main components of a tree? As you said, David, the first component are the roots. The roots, which are buried deep beneath the ground, carry tremendous importance. We have the roots. Without the roots, the tree would simply fall, it would blow away. So roots are very, very powerful. Then we have the trunk of the tree. The trunk of the tree, the stem that comes out from the ground, upon which all of the branches are carried. That is the trunk of the tree, and it's a very powerful, large, visible portion of the tree. And of course that's necessary, because without the trunk of the tree and its branches, we wouldn't be able to produce the third part of the tree, which is fruit. And so the fruit, of course, serve us in many ways. They give us nourishment, and they nourish animals. They provide sustenance and a source of life. But not just that, they also carry inside of them the seeds to plant another tree. So, quite clearly, we've got the trunk. Let's start from the beginning. The roots, the trunk, and the fruit. The 3 components of the tree. The reason that the Torah compares a human being to a tree is because we also possess these three components: roots, trunk, and fruit. And that's the example, the paradigm that we're going to use tonight to show and reflect on how we make a difference in this world by the difference we see that trees make. So let's take a deeper look at the connection between us and the tree. Because it's not just on one level, it's not just on two levels that we connect to trees. On three levels, human beings and trees connect. We have roots, trunks, and fruit in three different ways. So this is a very powerful connection that we have with trees. Those three levels of connection, those three perspectives of connection are psychological, chronological, and spiritual. So in a psychological realm, we have roots, trunk, and fruit. On a chronological level, we have roots, trunk, and fruit. And on a spiritual level, we have roots, trunk, and fruit. Three different levels. There we go. Three different levels of connection. Let's start with the psychological level. So we have the psychological level, which of course we know revolves around the mind. Psychology revolves around our intelligence, our capacity to understand and explore. A psychological level starts off with the roots. What is the roots of the psychological level? That's the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind, which we all have, is buried deep inside of our brains, deep inside of our head, and is often not visible, just like the roots of the tree. They cannot be seen, but they are there. They implant themselves early on, and they affect the way the rest of the tree will grow. Same too, that subconscious mind is affected by many things in our lives. And as a result, it grows and maintains its identity, although we don't always see it express itself clearly. Just like the roots. The body of the tree, the trunk of the tree, is our conscious mind. Our conscious mind, which we are constantly using, and that's literally constantly using. As it says in Hasidic philosophy, the one expression that you can never turn off is the expression of thought. You can stop doing things, you can stop saying things, but you can never stop thinking. You are always thinking. A human being is always thinking. You can change from one thought to the next, but you can't turn your mind off. You cannot turn it off, which is one of the differences between our form of meditation and other forms of meditation, is that when we meditate, as we do at our First Friday program, first Friday of every month at 6:30 p.m., a shameless plug, we don't encourage people to empty their minds simply for the sake of nullification. We encourage people to think about something specific and productive and focused, because we don't believe that a brain can ever truly be turned off. That is the conscious mind, constantly working. Just like the trunk of the tree, very visible, very seen, but let's not forget where the conscious mind comes from. It comes from the subconscious. And it is often there that the subconscious can express itself in some way, shape, or form. But the conscious mind is generally how we define ourselves. You consider yourself a certain kind of guy. I'm a funny guy, I'm a smart guy, I'm a friendly guy, I like crossword puzzles, I like Sudoku. This is who I am. That's all your conscious mind. Because very little of that subconscious gets to express itself visibly. Then we have the third level, the third dimension, which is the fruit of the trees. The fruit of the trees is how we affect other people. Our psychological impression on other individuals. What we're able to take and explain and instill in other individuals. Just like the fruit of the tree are taken to nourish other people, the fruit of the tree are taken to implant and grow other trees. Same too, our ideas can be translated and transformed and taken and taught to other people. And therefore, ideas can continue and can grow with other individuals and can handle the test of time. All of this is possible with our fruit, our expression of our psychological being. So here we have on the first dimension, on the psychological level, we have the roots, our subconscious buried deep down inside of us, the trunk, our conscious mind that gets most of the credit, how we define ourselves, how we see ourselves, generally how we think, and the fruit, what we take and translate and give to other people to nourish them, to satisfy them, to help them grow, and ultimately to give this idea life, just like the fruit gives seeds to produce new trees. Let's look at dimension number 2. Dimension number 2 is the chronological level. What is the chronological level? Again, the roots, the trunk, and the fruit. Let's start off with the roots. The roots are our childhood. Chronologically, the way we grow over time, the roots are our childhood. The way we are formed as children is extremely, extremely important. Just like the roots going into the ground. We don't see them. We don't always consider their value because, hey, they're not seen. Same too, children, they're not getting necessarily the visibility in the world that adults are getting. We're not necessarily ascribing the value because we don't see that visibility. So because we don't see them impacting the world around us, we don't recognize how important it is to invest time into this segment of the population. And we are making a huge mistake. Because as you know, if you scratch or hurt a tree, the trunk of a tree, it's just a scratch. But if you scratch or damage the seeds or the roots of a specific tree, that damage can be devastating and will ultimately affect the way this tree will grow. The Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, writes that when a scratch is made on a mature tree, the scratch will remain only at the location in which it was made and won't cause any harm to the remainder of the tree. It's a scratch right here, or as you've seen, markings on a tree. Maybe you and your high school sweetheart found a tree where you shared your first kiss. And it's there at that tree that you have this little heart engraved and etched with your names. Maybe there's a bow or an arrow or a little cupid if you're particularly skilled. In reality, you haven't really damaged that tree. You might even say you've enhanced that tree because now it's got sentimental value. But if you were to take a seed or a root and start etching stuff into that seed and that root, there's a good chance that you would destroy the potential of that tree to grow. The same way is with children. If a middle-aged person or someone that's already lived their life compromises their faith, compromises their values, but they've already lived a healthy, stable life for 30 or 40 years, even if they go through a difficult time, a midlife crisis, or like I'm experiencing, a quarter-life crisis, because let's be honest, midlife crises happen all the time, they can always revert back to what they know because they spent a significant portion of their life in a healthy place with the right perspective and the right stability. They know where to go. But if a child has been damaged, if a child's ability to grow has been hurt through the lack of education or the lack of nurturing, the lack of stability, they have nowhere to go when they get older. And those are roots damaged, causing a tree to grow off balance or defected from the get-go. So recognizing the importance, the vital importance that that stage in our life has is just like the roots of the tree buried deep down underneath the surface. Stage number 2, again, the trunk. How does the trunk reflect in our chronological level? The trunk is our time as adults. When we become adults, we understand. Now we have a purpose here in this world. We can be productive. We can contribute to society. It's the part of the tree that stands tall and holds up the fruit and so on and so forth. just like the trunks of the trees. So stage 2 is self-understood. It's a vital stage. It's your ability to contribute to society, just like the trunk now has the ability to produce this wonderful, wonderful fruit. Stage 3 is the fruit. How are the fruit related to a human being in the chronological level? Stage 3 is when you transfer from just being an adult to being a leader. And that's a stage that everybody goes through at some point in their lives. Because becoming an adult does not mean that you would necessarily become a leader. That's a decision you have to make. Leadership is for everyone. As we've talked many times at this discussion, leadership is in some way, shape, or form for every human being. We were all designed to be leaders. Sometimes in our families, in our careers, in our communities, but in some capacity, you were born to lead. And when you're ready to take that step, that's when you move to fruit. When you start to produce something and take your life in a way that can truly change someone else's life, can nurture, sustain someone else's life. When that becomes important to you and you start to think that way, then you've moved to stage 3, the fruit stage. And that's the full height of maturity, is when you're able to not only be independent for yourself, but also live for someone else. So when the tree grows its trunk, it's now strong, it's viable, it exists, but it's there just for itself. When it produces fruit, now it's there for someone else, for the human beings, for the animals, for the future trees that will come from its fruit. Same too with the human being. So again, on the chronological level, we have the trunk, the roots, trunk, and fruit. We have the childhood of an adult, of an individual, of a human being. We have adulthood of the human being. And then we have the leadership, the full maturation process of a human being. That's 2 levels. Level number 3. Level number 3 is the spiritual level. Again, another dynamic of connection between the tree and the human being. What is the spiritual connection between trees and human beings? So a rabbi once wrote that trees are made up of 3 general sections, as we said. The roots, which are concealed from the eye, but hold the main vitality of the tree. Not only that, roots are there because they hold back the tree from being uprooted during strong winds. We have the trunk of the tree, as we said, which holds the bulk of the tree. As time goes on, the trunk grows wider and wider and wider. So the most growth is seen in the trunk of the tree. And if you look at the trunk of a tree, you can tell its age. As we know, carbon dating and the dating process that's done by looking at the rings of trees is something that scientists use all over the world. And it's interesting to note that that's something that's often used to negate or contradict the traditional Jewish perspective on the age of the world. Because we believe the world is around for 5,773 years. And the rest of society believes that it's millions of years old, and one of their proofs is by looking at the rings of a tree. So you might say that a rabbi would simply say that science is hogwash. But here, the rabbi's writing specifically that it's a legitimate form of exploration into the age of the tree. The reason that the tree looks so old can be for many other reasons, and there are explanations whether the flood scorched the earth and therefore heightened the aging process, or some people like to explain that says that God created a mature world. Maybe it was mature, so it already looked much older than it was. But it's interesting that that scientific method is not denounced. The rabbi's actually legitimizing it. So that's the trunk. And then we have the third portion, the fruit. The fruit is the portion that ultimately plants seeds for generations and ensures that there will be trees again in the future. What does it mean that a human being is like a tree, spiritually speaking? Roots are faith. The root of a human being's spiritual exploration is faith. It's faith. And many times, people will say, I'm very spiritual, but I'm not sure what my faith is like. That statement makes absolutely no sense. Because if you are spiritual, then you must believe in something. To be spiritual means to recognize that there is a deeper sense to life, a deeper reality that exists below the surface of this visible world. Whether you understand what God is or isn't, or you simply see it as a higher power or a greater being or a chi, whatever you want to call it, that is a form of faith. And that is the core, that is the roots of your spirituality. Now, your faith may not be something that you're consciously thinking about all day. For most people, it's not. Even spiritual people. They're at work, they're with their families, they're spending time with hobbies, whatever they might be doing. They're not consciously thinking, here's what my faith is telling me at this time. Just like the roots are not constantly getting that visibility, but they are there. They're holding you down and making sure that your life has a focus and a discipline, because at its very core, at its source, it is rooted in faith. Number 2. Spiritual connection of a human being to a tree, the trunk. The trunk is the way that faith grows and expresses itself, primarily through the study of Torah, the study of our traditions, of our history, of our identity, and that observance of those traditions are the way we take that faith and we flourish it. We allow it to grow and to widen and to develop. And that ultimately becomes the visibility of our Jewish identity. You look at the tree, what do you see? Primarily the trunk. Same too, when we look at a person, we don't always see exactly what their faith is. We don't. Which is important not to judge people. We may look at someone and say, oh, that person has little faith. Because look how they look. That's not true. They have tremendous faith. But for whatever reason, they haven't allowed themselves to express it. And so therefore, there may be great roots underneath the tree, but ultimately, there's not much coming out on top. Somewhere along the way, there was a disconnect. But a healthy tree is one where the roots come and flourish into a beautiful trunk, where faith breeds observance, exploration, growth of our Jewish identity. Just like we allow every other aspect of ourselves to grow, sometimes even physically, we should allow this aspect, our spiritual aspect, to grow as well. Because if your spirituality is stagnant, if it's always the same, it's going to flatline. This is not a good thing. Not in medicine, not in spirituality, nowhere. It's not a good thing. You need to grow. And ultimately, if a tree's roots cannot produce trunks, if they can't produce branches and gain sunlight and water and so on, even the roots will eventually die. Faith that's not observed, it's not expressed, ultimately will have a difficult time sustaining itself. The third point of connection, spiritually, are the fruits. The fruits are the principal achievement of the tree, as we said. What are those fruits in spiritual life? The fruits are the acts that we take that express who we are. Our kindness, our generosity, the literal acts that we see that we do with other human beings in this world, that's what we imprint upon them and on the world around us, those acts that we take. And those are the ultimate definition of who we are. Because yes, a trunk might be beautiful, this tree might be wonderful, but if it's just a trunk, it's just a tree, it'll provide shade, it'll provide foliage, a nice scenery or landscape for 50, 60, or 70 years, and then it's gone. It's gone. And there's no remembrance of it. But if it produces fruit, then that tree, through those fruit, through the people that it has given sustenance to, through the seeds that it's implanted, it will live on and on and on and make a huge impact. One tree can produce fields of trees. Think about it. How many fruit come out of one tree? How many seeds come out of one fruit? The potential is endless if it will produce fruit. The same thing is with the human being spiritually. If it allows the faith to express itself into the trunk stage, into the learning, into the growth of Jewish identity, which further expresses itself into the action, the conduct of that individual. The way they conduct themselves with society, with human beings, the leadership roles that they take. As we said, how they take their psychological level, what they've learned and studied, and they explain and teach someone else. And of course, the greatest form of teaching we know is modeling. Modeling. Now there's a fancy term for it. What does modeling mean? Modeling means being a good example. That's the way you teach the most, to children and to others. So if you take that next step, if you allow your fruit to grow, then your Jewish identity, your spiritual identity, your all identity will continue and perpetuate itself for generations to come, through the people that you've impacted, through the lives that you've changed, through the ideas that you've taught. Those will be translated on and on and on. So without faith, without roots, a tree can't survive. You have to have roots. And you have to have strong roots, because let's be honest, even though you may grow a trunk, which means that you may start growing as a human being, as a Jewish person, in your faith you may grow and develop big, strong branches with lots of leaves. You may even start bringing fruit. You may start bearing fruit and start sharing ideas and teachings and ideologies. You may be the greatest example of a kind and good-natured individual, someone who's generous. So you've got a wonderful tree with big branches, big trunks, delicious fruit. But if your roots aren't solid, a strong wind can come along and simply uproot you. And let's look at society today. There are very strong winds, very strong winds. Society does not always support positive conduct. We have immorality, promiscuity, there's death, there's illness, there's conflict wherever you look. Fear, there's economic issues going on. Those are headwinds, winds that are coming directly at us from every direction. And each one of those winds have the potential to derail us from our conduct, to stop us in our tracks, to deviate and distract us from our personal growth and from our leadership and teachings to others. So we have to make sure that our roots buried deep down inside, our core faith is solid. Because as long as the core faith is solid, no matter how much that tree will sway, it will always be rooted deep in the ground. And will always come back to our source. This value that the Torah ascribes to trees, and it is an amazing value. I mean, we've just looked at 9 points of connection between a human being and trees. Not 1, not 2, not 3, 9 points of connection on a psychological level, on a chronological level, on a spiritual level. This deep relationship with trees is emphasized throughout Jewish tradition in some very interesting places. In the 5th book of the 5 books of Moses, in Devarim, which we mentioned previously, it says that when you besiege a city, or many times where Jewish people had to go to war, when you besiege a city for many days, and you're waging war to capture the city, you may try to cut off the water supply, cut the food supply, you may do a lot of things. But there's one thing you can't do. You cannot cut down a tree. It says, you shall not destroy the trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you can't cut them down. Maimonides writes, even further, that you cannot cut down the trees outside of a city to prevent an irrigation ditch from bringing water to them so that they dry up. He clarifies quite clearly. You might think if I cut down a tree, it'll block the water flow going into the city. These are wicked, terrible people. So ultimately, I want to get rid of them. Can't cut down the tree in order to do that. A fruit tree cannot be cut down unless you absolutely need to cut it down because you have to make way for another tree. What is the reason? Well, you might say the reason is because fruit are so important, it's a source of sustenance and life, but there are many sources of life and sources of sustenance. The ultimate reason why is because trees have such an important emphasis on life. They teach us such powerful lessons on life. When you stand and you look at a tree, you could be reminded of 9 lessons, 9 points of connection between you and that tree. And when you see those roots buried deep in the ground, hopefully it teaches you something about yourself, who you are, your roots, on a psychological level, on a chronological level, and on a spiritual level. And those fruit, when you see that fruit being shared with another human being, when you see someone planting those seeds in the ground, it reminds you the power that you have to bear fruit, just like that tree. To give birth and to give life to hundreds of trees, hundreds of other individuals and ideas for generations to come. The tree knows that ultimately its greatest reason for existence, its raison d'être, is because it is here to produce fruit. And a human being looks at a tree, is reminded of exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. I'm not here just for the glory. I'm not here just to get credit, to get into the newspaper, to get my name on a headline. No. Because then it would all be about just the trunk. How big my trunk is. You ever been to the Redwood State Park in California, where they have trunks so large you can drive a car through them? And I've done that. They hollow out the trunk, and it's amazing. But ultimately, if that tree did not produce any fruit or any seeds, there wouldn't be any redwoods. So even though the redwood's huge, never loses sight of what its ultimate responsibility is. Thank you, Dave. Here. That is why, thank you, Dave. The Talmud tells us that if someone teaches another person, it's like they've given birth to them. It's like they're a son or a daughter. Yes, you didn't physically give them life, but through your teachings, you've inspired and motivated them. You've caused them to grow. And so therefore, you have literally, in some way, shape, or form, enhanced their life, given them life. And they will take those ideas and give them to others. Just like a tree taking its fruit, taking its seeds, and implanting it in the ground to produce the next generation of trees. So that is a responsibility that we all carry. But you have to know where it comes from. Understand where your roots are. Understand your source. Understand your faith. Understand your subconscious. Understand your childhood. Then, understand your trunk. Your trunk is your conscious mind. How do you define yourself? What do you spend your time thinking about? Where is your brain power being used? Look at your adulthood. Your adulthood, now that you're independent. What have you done with your independence? How have you been productive in society as an adult? Now that you've been given options, how have you used them? Are you growing? Look at your spiritual trunk. Are you growing? Are you exploring? Are you journeying? Or are you stagnant? Are you status quo? And finally, look at the fruit. How are you expressing your ideas to other people? Your thoughts? Are you sharing them with other people? Or are you keeping them only for yourself? Have you become a leader? Are you bearing fruit as a leader? Touching the lives of other people, your family, your friends, your colleagues, your community? How are you conducting yourself? Your fruit spiritually speaking. How do you live your life every single day? How do you connect with other people? What's your interpersonal relationships like? These are all of the lessons that the tree ultimately teaches us. There's something else that a tree teaches us that's very powerful, that ultimately will answer the question of how do I see the significance of my life in this vast universe. It says in Tehillim, the book of Psalms, written by King David, the poet, the musician, the warrior. David writes, "Man is like a breath. His days are as a fleeting shadow," which is, it's beautiful. But what does it mean that the days are like a fleeting shadow? So, in the Medrash, in the commentary on the book of Psalms, the rabbis write, if only life would be like the shadow cast by a wall, or like the shadow of a tree. But alas, it is like the shadow of a bird in flight. Okay. So life can be like a shadow, but there's three different kinds of shadows. There's the shadow of a wall, the shadow of a tree, and the shadow of a bird in flight. Let's see, what are these three different lifestyles? Three different ways that you can live your life, like three different shadows. So, a shadow is something that's here, and then it's gone. A shadow is how we cast our image onto something else. Think about it. When I would walk to shul with my daughter Chana, who's almost 4 years old, she used to always tell me that I should put my shadow on her. Sometimes it was getting dark at night, and through the light coming through on the streets, she sees the shadow, so she tells me, put my shadow on her. And it was her fun thing to try and walk in my shadow. But she was right. The shadow is my way of taking my life and impacting, covering someone else's. That's what the shadow represents. So what are the three methods of impact? The 3 points of impact, the 3 styles of impact: the shadow of the wall, the shadow of the tree, and the shadow of the bird. So the shadow of the bird, let's start with that. The shadow of the bird is the most fleeting. It's the most fleeting. A bird is flying through life, going 90 miles a minute. And that reflects on the lifestyle of a human being that's moving so fast. Sometimes getting lots done. They're working 12, 13, 14 hours a day. They're putting in 80-hour weeks. And they're just zipping through life. One milestone passes, the next milestone passes. They're just running, going through. But in reality, when you move that fast through life, your shadow, your impact on the world around you, your connection to other people, and the impact on their lives is also going to be fleeting. Here one day, gone the next. And you may turn around at the end of this journey and say, where did it all go? Where's everyone else? You've left them all behind. And so your shadow, your impact on their lives might have been powerful for a day, maybe an hour, maybe a minute, but then it's gone. Professor once standing before his philosophy class was trying to emphasize to them how one should spend their time and evaluate their life. So he took a jar, big jar, takes the jar, and he takes the jar and puts in a bunch of golf balls. Large golf balls. Puts them inside the jar. Until the jar was full. They could not get any more golf balls inside of this jar. He says to class, everyone see the jar is full? They say, yes, we see that the jar is full. Okay. He comes back from his office with a box of pebbles. He says, I want you now to pour as many pebbles into the jar as you possibly can. Sure enough, they start pouring the pebbles in. They jiggle the jar back and forth, and they can get quite a few pebbles into some of those cracks that were left by the large golf balls. Turns to the classroom and he says, so, is the jar full? They say, yes, it's full. Absolutely. Okay, goes back into his office, comes back with some sand. Box of sand. He says, all right, let's get the sand in there. Sure enough, there's room for the sand. They pour the box of sand in and they move it around, and now it's really looking compact. The golf balls, the space left by the golf balls been filled up by the pebbles, and whatever space left over by the pebbles, as microscopic as it is filled with the sand. He turns to the class and says, is it full? They say, oh yes, now it's full. goes into his office, comes back with a 6-pack of beer. I do not endorse using beer for experiments. I want to make sure that's clearly understood. I would never disgrace a beer just for an experiment. But he gives him the beer and he says, all right, get the beer in there. And sure enough, they take the beer, they pour it out, and it gets seeped into the sand, and now it's absolutely full. The beer is all the way up to the top, together with the sand and the pebbles and the golf balls. He turns to them and he says, if you would put the sand in first, if the sand went first into that jar, would there have been any space for the golf balls? The answer is no. Sand would have filled up to the very top. There'd be no space to put any golf balls in. He turns to the class and he says, the golf balls represent the big things in life. The big ones, the important ones, the priorities, the main decisions, the reasons why we are here. Get those in your jar first. Make sure that they stay the priority. Take care of them. Give them a place in your life. And once you've done that, once you've secured their place in your list of priorities, in your ultimate goals, then you move on to the smaller stuff, the pebbles and the sand. And you know what? Even if there's a little bit of space, throw in the beer. But don't do it the other way around. Because if you start off with the small stuff, and all you're worried about is working 80-hour weeks, making $100,000, getting that big house, which, let's see, in the scope of things is small stuff. If that's what you're worried about, you'll fill up your entire life with that, and by the end, there'll be no space for golf balls. Your space will have been filled. That's the shadow of the bird. What is the shadow of the wall? Shadow of the wall is a better lifestyle, a healthier lifestyle. Because if you look at the shadow of a wall, it's not here 1 second, gone the next. It's here for a while, maybe even a couple of hours. Right? You ever looked at the shadow of a wall? You see it in the morning, right when the sun comes over it on one side. Then you don't see it very much at all, but then you'll see it again by the end of the day, when the sun is now on the opposite side of the wall. So it has some staying power, and it is somewhat consistent. It's there day in, day out. And therefore, the wall can help people. It could provide some shade. It can keep people from the heat. It does have some impact on its surroundings, but not consistently for the entire day. That represents the fact that oftentimes in life, we do understand our priorities. When we're young, when we're children, when we're starting off our lives, we're fresh. We want to change the world. We want to be astronauts. We want to be firefighters. We want to be CEOs, sports players, basketball players. We want to do so much. But then we go through life, and in reality, that all gets readjusted. It all gets readjusted and reevaluated. Our goals come down. Our dreams get clipped. And we start to bite the bullet. We start to bite the bullet because, hey, this is the way life is. Life's just not fair. You ever heard that? Life's just not fair. Get a real job. Oh, everybody has heard that. What's going to become of you? This is not a way to live. And slowly, we get taken from one notch down to another notch, down to another notch, and so on and so forth. And as a result, we take some of those big goals that we had and we put them away. And we realign ourselves with what society says you've got to do. So personal growth, time for studying, time with our family, we'll get to it eventually. We know it's important. Hey, we know it's important. Those were our childhood goals and dreams. But you know what? Right now, I've got to concentrate on my business. Right now, I got to go hunting with my friends. I got to go partying. I don't have time to do Friday night Shabbat, even if it's 30 minutes with the First Friday program. Second shameless plug. I simply don't have time. I got to go catch this movie. I can't afford to do anything else. That is the wall. That's the shadow of the wall. Yep, it's here for a few minutes, beginning of the day. That's our focus in the beginning of life. But you know what? It'll come back at the end of life, but it may be too late at that point. At the end of life, you'll start to reevaluate and reassess and look around and say, you know what? I had it right in the beginning. I had the right perspective. What happened? Don't let that be your life. Don't let that be your shadow. Don't let that be your influence on the world around you. Good in the beginning, but then gone for a long time, and then shows up with a fury and a vengeance at the end. Because it may be too late at that point. Ultimately, what you are trying to aspire is to have the shadow of the tree. The shadow of the tree, that is the ultimate. Because the shadow of the tree is there all day, every day. At any point during the day, the sun hits the tree and emits a beautiful shadow, which covers and encompasses the diameter of the tree. You can always go under the tree for shade. Doesn't matter what day it is, doesn't matter how hot the sun is, how much it's beating it out, you can always go down and find shade in the tree. And that's what you are aspiring to. You are aspiring to have an impact on your surroundings every day, every hour, every minute. You've set your goals as a child. You've reaffirmed them as an adult. You're implementing them now. You're making it happen. These are your fruit. And you've realized that it's all about my fruit. It's not about the 60-hour work week. It's about what lessons I'm going to teach someone else. It's about what I'm going to carry over to the next generation. And when I have that perspective, I have true shade. I'm a leader. People can always find advice, wisdom, encouragement underneath my branches. They can always eat from my fruit. My shadow is always there, consistently. It doesn't wane, it doesn't change. Society may come, winds may blow and try to uproot me, but my roots are so strong that my shade will continue to survive for generations. And when my time finally comes and it's time for this tree to wither, my seeds that I've implanted will grow and provide shade for generations to come after me. As the story's told about a man that was traveling down a road, and he sees another gentleman out by the side of the road planting a carob tree. Carob tree. Now, carob trees take a very long time to grow. They can take 70 to 80 years before they produce their first fruit. Their first fruit. And this was a man that was later on in life. So, he turns to the man that's planting, and he says to him, I don't understand. Why are you planting this tree? You're not really going to get much shade out of it. You're not even going to get fruit out of it. Plant something else. So he turns around and he says, look behind you. You see those beautiful trees that you just took carob from? Do you know why they're here? Because my grandfather took the time, the patience, to sit and plant a carob tree. He planted it for you and for me. And that's why I'm planting this tree, because I want my children and grandchildren and your grandchildren to be able to walk down this very same road and eat from the carob tree. So we may not always see it, but it remains our goal to share our fruit, to share our shadow with our surroundings. There's a story that's told about God. God created a dog, and God created the dog, and he tells the dog, I want you to go to the house, our house, sit outside the house, and anybody that walks into the house, you're going to bark and alarm me that someone is coming into the house. Okay. Dog says, what am I getting for this? Says, I'll give you a lifespan of 20 years. All right? So the dog's going to live for 20 years, and in return, he's going to be the alarm to make sure that no one enters the house that shouldn't. Dog says, that's a long time to be barking. I got to bark outside the house for 20 years? Tell you what, take away 10 years, and I'll do it. God says, okay, I'll give you 10 years instead of 20. In 10 years, you'll bark outside the house. The second day of creation, God creates a monkey. The monkey comes, and God says to the monkey, you are going to entertain people. That's your job in life. You're going to entertain people. You're going to do tricks and so on and so forth. And I'm going to give you a 20-year lifespan. The monkey says, wow, that's a long time that I'm going to have to doing tricks and entertaining people. Can I get the same deal the dog did? God says, sure. I'll take 10 years back. You can do it for 10 years. 10 years will be your lifespan. On the third day, God creates a cow. And he says, all right, you're going to go into the field with a farmer, and all day long you're going to be suffering under the sun, and you're going to be giving birth to other calves, and you're going to produce milk and support the farmer's family. You're going to do this for 60 years. 60 years. Wow, the cow says, that's crazy. 60 years? That's way, way too long. I can't do it for 60 years. He says, you know what? I'll give you back 40 years. 40 years, take away 40 years, I'll do it for 20. God says, sure, no problem. I'll give you 20 years. So we've got the dog living for 10, the monkey's going to live for 10, the cow's going to live for 20 years. God, sure enough, on the fourth day, creates a human being. He turns to a human being and he says, I've created you to eat and to sleep and to play, get married, enjoy life. I'm going to give you 20 years to do it. What does the man say? I only get 20 years to enjoy life? Maybe you can give my 20 and the 40 that the cow gave back and the 10 that the monkey gave back and the 10 the dog gave back, give them to me. I'll take them. I'll use them and I'll enjoy life. And I'll live to 80 years old. God says, sure, no problem. And that's why, if you think about it, that's what we do with our lives. We may live for 80 years, but we spend 10 years. The first 10 years we sit and do nothing, just like the dog, right? The next 10 years we spend in our lives entertaining people, joking around, playing around, just like the monkey. Then we spend... Who's the next guy? Then we spend 40 years like the cow, slaving away in the sun. And then maybe the last 10 years, we get to do something special. So, it's a joke, of course, but the reality is that our 80 years of life, is it truly 80 years that we live? Or is it just portions of time? All right, I'll take 10 years, I'm just a kid. Another 20 years, I'm a teenager, I'm a young adult trying to figure things out. All right, I'm 40, 50 years old. I'm starting to get the hang of this. I see some value here. But it's really all about me at that point. When you're 40s and 50s, I've reached the prime, the peak of my life. It's all about me. Well, when you're 60 and 70, you're starting to get some independence. You've hit your retirement. So really, how much of your life do you actually live for something powerful and meaningful? And the reality is very little. And so yes, if you take that approach to life, your value and impact on the world around you will be limited. But if you take 80 years and you turn those 80 years into a tree with strong roots, with a powerful, large trunk, and fruits and shade for everyone around you, then you can bring about tremendous impact and difference in the world, just like one tree does. One tree does for the world around us. The decision is something that you have to make. You have to decide. And every time you go out and you look at trees, this is what should be running through your brain. How are my roots? How are my trunk? And where is the fruit that I was created to produce? And if that remains your task, that remains your goal, then you will do everything possible to produce those fruit. If it means working less, if it means spending time with your family, if it means donating time to your JCC, your Chabad house, your synagogue, if it means giving charity, whatever way you're going to find, you're going to produce as many fruit as possible because you know that's why you were created. And that's how you make a difference in the world around you. That concludes our discussion for tonight. As always, you're welcome to send any and all questions, comments, and especially critiques to askmendy@gmail.com. askmendy@gmail.com. Next week, we will talk about challenging nature, the politics of in vitro fertilization, IVF. Do we simply accept what nature gives us, or do we try to change it? And we'll be looking specifically at the difficulty in childbearing. Again, next Monday night at 7:30 p.m. Tomorrow night, Dina will be hosting the lesson 5 of her Jewish cooking boot camp called Smells Like Grandma's House. You can still reserve by visiting our website, ChabadSouthTampa.com. Have a wonderful evening.